Well, good morning, good afternoon, good evening, wherever you're dialing in from. I'm Gary Fisher, and it's my pleasure to welcome you to what I think is going to be a very interesting and probably provocative conference that addresses head-on does workplace planning work. Before we launch into the discussion, let's talk about how this is going to flow. First, we're going to level the playing field so we all understand what advanced work packaging and workplace planning actually are. Then we're going to talk about observations and data from the front lines from the field, some time for Q&A, and then discuss what our recommendations would be for you who are out in the trenches trying to make all this happen. So let's touch real quickly on how the Q&A works. On your screen, you should see a little area there where you can type in a question. So please type in your questions as we go. We've got a team that's evaluating, looking over those questions. They'll be feeding those to me during the Q&A time so that we can address those. So let's get started by first introducing our panelists. Glenn Ballard, raise your hand, Glenn. There he is a member of the Construction Industry and Management Program, Faculty and Research Associate for the Project Production Systems Laboratory at UC Berkeley. That's a mouthful. He's an expert in lean construction, author, and expert advisor to many organizations that you would recognize, such as Bechtel, Ford, U.S. Department of Defense. Glenn's on the front lines of innovation and capital projects. Wayne Crabtree, Wayne, is currently a continuous improvement advisor for Chevron's project management system, has been on the forefront of introducing project production management across the enterprise. He also comes to us on the front lines where Chevron is using advanced work packaging, work-based planning, project production management, and has some very interesting data in comparison on capital projects for us to consider. Matt Parsons, there in the middle. Matt is a partner and managing director of Boston Consulting Group, where he specializes in the energy and operations practice areas, particularly in large capital project management. He comes to us also with great observations from the front lines. And allow me to introduce myself briefly. I recently retired from Chevron, where I was accountable for Chevron's project management system. After towards the end of my career, I came to understand operations science and how much of a game changer that was for capital projects. And my passion for promoting its use in the energy sector just won't go away. So I've continued on supporting the Project Production Institute. It's my pleasure to be facilitating this conference today. So let's get started. You know, there's a lot of hype in the industry about advanced work packaging, its associated benefits, and it's really quite remarkable to me how it's spreading given the dearth of actual hard data that shows it actually improves performance. You know, thinking back when CII tackled the issue of craft productivity, I was excited because we thought that was a major problem on our projects, and we invested heavily in supporting that research. We put a person on the team, we volunteered projects. In fact, we had one very large, challenging project in Nigeria that experimented with these concepts as they're being developed. And you know, we did see productivity, craft productivity improve as we measured it, but not necessarily a translation to the bottom line. And after that project, we tried it on some others. And again, we saw what appeared to be promising results with craft productivity, but not that connection so much to the bottom line performance. And then finally, on one very large LNG project in Australia, advanced work packaging, work-based planning, it just blew up in our faces. I mean, it just turned into a total mess. And that left us saying, what the heck is going on here? Why is this happening? Why doesn't this work? Well, the answers were out there. We just hadn't discovered them. Back in 2014, as all this was being developed by the CII, Glenn did some really deep thinking and looked it over carefully and proposed some research that would test the effectiveness of AWP and work-based planning. However, really nobody took him up on following through on that research. So today, we're going to pick up where he left off and address the concerns that he identified now some 6 years ago. But before we go there, let's start with leveling the playing field on what advanced work packaging and work-based planning are. So Matt, I'll turn it over to you.
Thank you, Gary. I appreciate the opportunity and for the introduction. First, before we get into the guts of what our panelists are going to tell you, want to review the history of advanced work packaging and work-based planning, where it came from. In the early 2000s, there was what was referred to as the lost decade of oil and gas projects in Alberta, largely around the tar sands. During a fly up in oil prices, as is common in the cyclical industry, there was a rush to exploit sources of production that were previously uneconomic. There was a rush to the field before they were ready for production. The outcomes were extraordinarily destructive, and out of this grew a research effort from the construction owners of Alberta into the sources of trouble. And they launched a comprehensive study into what it would take to plan for execution better and release constraints. You know, ultimately, the output of this research was delivered to CII, a 200-member organization, of which many of the people on this call are undoubtedly affiliated with organizations that are members, as are some of us for that matter. CII has promulgated 17 best practices. The last two to be added were planning for modularization and Workface planning and advanced work packaging. To be a CII best practice, the practice, and I quote, must be sufficiently proven through extensive industry use and or validation. In the case of Workface planning and advanced work packaging, they talk about a 25% increase in field productivity and a 10% cost reduction, or 10% reduction in total installed cost, benefits which some of my other panelists have not seen on their projects. On the productivity point, I'd advertise that from a technical perspective, people often confuse resource utilization with actual productivity, which in the truest sense is a measure of throughput. And this confusion ends up being critical in the case of Workface planning and advanced work packaging. A couple things before we get into definitions without all the editorializing. What we are not saying today, one, that it's counterproductive to plan for execution. Indeed, it's essential. Secondly, that releasing constraints for workers in the field trying to show up to work and do a good job is not productive. Indeed, it's part of our responsibilities as managers and leaders. What we are universally saying today is that we disagree about the how. So without further ado, Christian, if we could get into the technical presentation. Now, first, this is drawn directly from the CII implementation research topic 319 and special publication 166 TAC 4. Advanced work packaging is the overall process flow for all the detailed work packages from engineering to construction to installation. In other words, it's not a plan for how to do the work, merely for how to create and flow the paper. It is administrative. Secondly, Workface planning is the process of organizing and delivering all elements for a field installation work packages before work is started, such that it is constraint-free. Now, in terms of the actual installation work packages themselves, they're designed to be single discipline, you know, welder, earth mover, etc. So in the translation from the plot plan, which by definition is multidisciplinary, to the construction work packages, which are often multidisciplinary, we are drawn to installation work packages that are single trade. For those of you who have commissioned complicated facilities, we know this would leave a burden at the back end of integrating back to a systems view for pre-commissioning and pre-operational testing. The second point is that the field installation work packages are designed to be 500 to 1,000 hours of work by the CII specification. And this cannot be stressed enough. It is designed for 1 week of craft labor. In the case of 500-hour work packages, this is about 10 personnel, 1 Workface planner, 1 superintendent, or in the case of 1,000-hour work packs, it's for 2 weeks. We'll offer that in my application and in the capital projects industry, I've seen this methodology used with no adherence to the original process specification. Lastly, what I would offer is that the burden for planning, preparing the constraint-free installation work packages by the specification falls on the Workface planner. And the Workface planner is a resource that, you know, by suggestion, has about 20 years of experience, 10 years of direct craft experience as a superintendent, has the organizational bandwidth to reach across siloed capital project organizations to release constraints, and is fluent in modern technology. I would pulse you in your organizations, how many of these people qualified for this role do you have? But that is what Workface planning is by design. Kristen, if we could move to the next slide. This is a map drawn from a resource and execution resource called Schedule for Sale that outlines the timeline for removal for FIWP constraints. If execution week is week 0, this is a step back 8 weeks of time. And based upon when the CWP is issued for construction to when it's actually translated into a constraint-free release, you know, there are about 10 or 15 process milestones here that must be met. The implication from this guidance is that you need a minimum of 4 weeks of construction material on site. This is an investment in working capital such that it's there. It requires work package predictability of 8 weeks ahead. So a lot of adherence in terms of percent plan complete and commitment reliability, even to make it work. Most of us don't know what we're doing 8 weeks from now. How do we know that on a construction site? And then lastly, there's limited focus on handoffs, only that prerequisite work is satisfied 6 weeks ahead. So there are 4 and 6 week hold times built into the production system. But again, by my own admission, actually adhering to these constraints in the field, I've seen wide deviations, which makes it, you know, difficult to make any conclusive recommendations. But before I hand over back to Gary, I'd leave you with 2 provocations. You know, the first is that if PII best practices, including AWP and Workface planning, are used extensively and validated, why do capital outcomes remain predictably and consistently poor? The second provocation, if we accept both the premises that these are widely embraced and improve execution, and simultaneously that outcomes are poor, what is missing? With that, that's my intro to Workface planning and advanced work packaging, Gary.
Excellent, great thoughts, Matt. So now, Glenn, let's look back at your work that you did in 2014 and the questions that you raised about all this.
All right, thanks, Gary. In 2014, we only had access to CII Research Team 272, but subsequently 319 has been published, and I've looked at that and studied it carefully, and I haven't found any reason to change our assessment of AWP and our concerns about it, or our hypotheses about what we will find, what it should produce based upon its structure or its lack of structure. Okay, so I think this is the punchline. I'll start with the punchline and work back to support it.
Okay.
So based on the published recommendations and descriptions of AWP, we, that is the Project Production Systems Laboratory, predicted that projects that try to follow those recommendations will either deviate from the AWP model or take longer and cost more. Okay, slide. Now, Gary, I'm sorry, Matt has already mentioned this, but a fundamental assumption of AWP is that improving labor utilization will improve cost and schedule, right? And I think Matt has mentioned some evidence contrary to that, contrary evidence that I think Wayne will provide more later. But it's simply not. First of all, the problem is that it's a misunderstanding of the nature of productivity. Productivity is the product of labor utilization times labor fruitfulness. That is the output per unit of productive labor. But even if you did improve productivity, real productivity, you wouldn't necessarily improve cost and schedule performance. In fact, it may well be, in many cases, depending upon the situation and the client, especially what's valued to the client, that you may want to sacrifice capacity in order to increase throughput, that is project delivery. So there's a fundamental concern about the basis for AWP right there. And then secondly, critical processes within AWP are not specified. And again, echoing Matt, basically the process definition that's provided is about how do you assemble these informational work packages, right? But that doesn't make projects run, right? What's this? How do you spec? There's really, well, let me just add one little thought here. So in 319, they add to what they call the checklists. And the checklists are presumably the guides to practitioners for implementing AWP. And they more than double the number of checklist items, but all of those checklist items specify what should have been done, but do not explain how. Okay? There's no process definition, and there's some, in addition to that, there's some fundamental omissions. So slide, please. Okay, so I think this is really a critical piece, that control of work packaging and the whole work packaging process through into installation is limited to scheduling delivery times. And this is an embrace of a fantasy, right? The fantasy that you can cause the future through saying what you want it to be, right? But in fact, all plans are forecasts, all forecasts are wrong, and forecast error increases with period, that is how far in advance you try to plan, and level of detail. AWP, like the CPM approach generally, embraces plan early, plan in the greatest possible detail. And if you don't get good results, the claim is, well, you didn't plan early enough and you didn't plan in great enough detail. Well, that's throwing gasoline on the fire. Right? So this dream of predetermination is actually inevitably becomes a nightmare. Right? So another key problem is, and it's an omission, is that there is no specification of how work is to flow between trades. Right? Okay, and what that's called in production science is transfer batch, right? So when we release work from one workstation to the next, that's called the transfer batch, right? And generally speaking, all things else being equal, if that transfer batch is bigger, your project will take longer, right? If it's smaller, your project will take less time. Now, that just with everything else being equal, but it's an absolutely central piece to look at when you're looking at system design, and that's not specified. Some other problematic choices: why have work packages at all? Speaking of the information package, what use is that information? By whom and when? And is the choice that AWP makes to produce them early and in a high level of detail, is that the best solution? And I suggest that it isn't. IWP batch size. Matt mentioned this, but what's the basis for this? Why not a smaller batch size? Right? If you had a smaller batch size, couldn't you manage it better? And you wouldn't put yourself in position of depending upon hitting time targets made way in advance of execution, right? Which is inevitably going to fail in some degree. And if it fails, it increases complexity and reduces flexibility. IWP lead times. They specify lead times, but there's no basis for it. Is there a calculation? Is there something? Again, it just it's a gray area. And then this decision to replace trade supervisors with planners seems to go against the grain, certainly of the lean construction tradition, where we found it much more successful to engage the people who are going to do the work in planning and preparing it. So slide, please. Okay, so because AWP is not well defined, those who try to put it into practice will either suffer the consequences or be compelled to develop processes that are not specified in the AWP literature. Now, I'm just repeating myself, I know, but I'm repeating it because it leads to a fundamental problem. And that's the problem of how do you assess the effectiveness of AWP if people are going to be forced, compelled to invent pieces of the production system that have not been specified in AWP. So when we see reports of performance improvement, what's the basis for that improvement? Is it what's specified in AWP, or is it people trying their best to manage in a bad situation? Okay, slide please. Okay, so just to wrap up, this was done in 2014, right? But I stick by it now. I think that if they don't deviate from AWP specifications to the extent that they are, this is what we're going to find. And I would suggest that we go find out. Right? Huge inventory growth, poor labor productivity, higher cost, and longer durations. In other words, exactly the opposite of what AWP promises to deliver.
Wow, I'd say you're pretty prophetic. And maybe this could be written in hindsight right now. Now we're going to hear a bit from the front lines and reflect on these hypotheses. So Wayne, you've been on the front lines here. Let's talk about this.
So probably on the front line of frustration, any job in continuous improvement in the major capital project delivery world develops what I call CDO, becoming a chief disgruntled officer. There's, and I'll bookend my observations by landing on the high cost and durations first. We have just gone through a period of 10 years in Chevron, and investing in major capital projects has been deemed a very, very poor investment strategy indeed. So much so that we've inherited a change in the redesign of what Gary had built with the preceding management. Unfortunately, some of the elements we're talking about today have made their way into the redesign of project delivery model for Chevron. I'm going to start out making some observations. 2013, 2014, I walked the material value chains from onshore Perth and Fremantle all the way down to the island of Barrow Island where the facility was located. One thing I could say to describe relative to huge inventory growth, all the material that project required, which did not complete itself until 2016, was present in on site in some form or fashion in 2013. More than 13,000, it was close to 14,000 installation work packages were designed for the cost of $120 million. That project overran in the billions. Now, we're not saying that the Workface planning problem drove all of that. This is a very complex issue. We are locating a pivotal insight relative to the behavior of material flow and production control. It's the failure to synchronize those two pieces that creates a tsunami of material, and that's exactly what we observed out there on Gorgon. We spent literally, from a logistics perspective, an additional $4 billion outside of what we projected. And yes, there were some unique circumstances, such as an introduced quarantine requirement from the government of Australia. But the fact that all the inventory was out there, we ended up quarantining and re-quarantining the material because it sat too long. That was only one element of cost that produced escalation. We were flying in material by cargo planes when that material sat in some form on the logistical trail that people couldn't, the workers couldn't find it. We had design components that became redundant because the design in the field had changed over the course of the few years that the project had progressed. All of these compound into an escalation of cost, an escalation of duration that really has haunted our MCPs. My hope in this discussion is to aggregate observations across the board. CII is pretty clear about its embrace on not only work packaging, that needs to be defined a little more carefully relative to the operations science we talk about, but there's also lean construction program that is also a system, a body of knowledge, but usually it's contracting. And then there's project production management, which I think at the very top of the bill, if you want to understand how to change a project, is probably getting a mindset where you view projects as a series of production systems. So talking about large batch sizes, when we've been progressing engineering from a discipline focus in different regional offices that have the expertise, let's say in electrical in one location, mechanical in another, and we're trying to chase a percentage of completion of engineering, irrespective of the sequence that may be in demand downstream, this has been a recurring problem, to the point that we say, well, you know, our FEL procedures are not right, our front-end loading is not designed, engineering is a problem. Really, the failure is to understand what's available in concurrent design and to start avail ourselves of how we can do simultaneous workloads. This is some of the direction that Chevron is taking right now. I'm optimistic that over time, they may benefit from the applications of you know, digital systems that can model production systems. So maybe I've just highlighted a few things on our most recent deployment of Workface planning. We do have the pillars of Lean, or Lean Sigma, the pillars of advanced work planning, the pillars of production control. And in those instances, we've been able to compare work processes that are purely under IWP management with that push plan, and those that are more tailored to reduce scopes of work from a production planning. We're finding a delta in productivity that is insightful and should be informing us as to maybe there's some merit in understanding the design of the flow of work, the synchronization of flow from the material side. There's always variability in flow. There's always variability in the work processes. The tsunami is a crash between those two failing to synchronize from a mechanism that can better serve that gap. I'll stop there, but maybe you can ask questions, Gary, just to probe. But
Yeah, so
I've
Wayne,
been sitting here for 7 years.
on that project, when you look at work that's under installation work packages and work that's under that, in addition, project production control, what's the difference in schedule performance of that planned work?
So in instances where we found pure installation work package approach, we found that there's been a 68% change in the IWP constituents in the design of the IWP, which means there's recycle work, right? There's we're improving the classic measure of productivity, right? Where we've been down at the mid-range of 50% productivity, we're exceeding 100%. In factors of 1.2, 1.3 of productivity. Now, I want to point out, Glenn said that productivity is not what we're chasing. Productivity is an element of individual ability to produce and spend hours on tools. And that's the classic definition that we rolled out when we embraced the body of knowledge in IWP. We did time studies, we did all sorts of things in order to ensure that our laborers had the material and were busy on tools. We're finding out that just increased productivity in one area, I'll just land on this. We, except for example, there was the purchase of fabrication of huge concrete blocks for Gorgon. There were thousands of them. And the procurement people wanted to optimize the cost. And they surely did. And so what happened is, for opening up the fabrication to just produce at their design, their pace, we found out they outproduced their own yard, laydown yard. We had to purchase a laydown yard 7 miles away from this location. And then we spent our time in a cottage industry trying to sort out the blocks that needed to arrive at the site. There was a 30-day process, 30-day window of time that literally the supply flow material came to a screeching halt. Nothing could move. All capacity was utilized. The barges were filled. The conveyance of all the trailers that were used to bundle the IWPs were all filled. Every area was filled, and the laborers and workers in the field was still screaming for the right material to arrive on site. So a little bit more clear about how we design this is something I'm saying would be of value to us all.
I don't want to gloss over the first bit of data that you gave there. So you're saying that work on that one project that's under IWPs only without the benefit of production control took 60% longer, same kind of work, took 60% longer. So we're talking, this is great laboratory, same contractors, same kind of work, same environment, everything's the same. The only difference is one crew's using production control, another crew is not. And the work that wasn't under production control is taking 60% longer. That's really big.
Yeah, so the 60% is in reference to the percentage of change relative to the IWP itself. The reduction of cycle time to complete work was associated with reducing the size of the package. And then you had cycle time reduction that compares to 30–40% improvement in comparison to the failure to adopt a worker-based plan and control approach.
I think you just said yes, but I'm not entirely sure.
I tend to confuse people, and that's my charm. Yes.
Yeah. Okay. Good. So we're just in a couple of minutes here before we have to move on. Now that you understand operation science, what are the fatal flaws that you see in the way we've practiced, Chevron's practice advanced work packaging?
So you're asking me that. So we've learned a lot over the last 7 years. So number one, and I think this is adopted in most thinking around project delivery in Chevron, or at least move in that direction. Viewing projects as a production system is a vital framework. I think the industry needs to look at a uniform framework, develop a common language around what they mean by system, production system, and then start looking at the measurement systems that can actually produce the measurement and benchmarking that could actually be derived as an absolute benchmarking based on work processes. So production system number one. Number two, we outsource the ownership of the actual execution of the work process. We're not interested as an owner to understand how a contractor wants to do their work. We actually were introduced by default into being in charge of work processes that contractors own by being the construction manager on Gorgon. We had to, but that was a very, very important period of time to get the insight that being a construction manager is no different to being a safety manager. And we know this, and I'm just going to land in this way. If we're treating capital stewardship the same way that we have treated safety stewardship, we would all know that the common denominator are the management of tasks along a flow line of several tasks with safety mitigation in mind and a review of how you perform to the design on a continual and daily basis, right? So we're saying that stewardship is not there at the level we need to control the outcomes or even be predictive. And one last comment, we've been chasing predictive outcomes on projects and we have not attained that end. We are far from being competitive. Before you can be competitive, you need to be predictive. And so the construct is we need a production system. We need to understand the dynamics of operations science. We need the privilege of actually designing projects in several production systems, controlling them as such, and learning how to improve on that.
Okay, so we need to keep moving on here. I think you've laid out some very interesting thoughts and some good data. In fact, at least personally, as I come to understand operations science, I saw that, AWP work-based planning actually can't work. That singular focus on craft productivity cannot improve project performance. And in fact, I've seen many examples where it actually made project performance worse. Better craft productivity hurt project performance, just like Glenn theorized, huh? So let's go to Matt with some additional observations from the front line and the contrast of AWP and production management.
Thank you, Gary. And Kristen, if we could go to this slide. So, to revisit a couple of the core questions I left you with at the start of our presentation. One, if these CII best practices, including number 17, work-based planning and advanced work packaging, are extensively used and validated, why do outcomes continue to remain consistently poor? Hopefully you found our presentation compelling today, but number one, it's not extensively used due to a lack of process specification. If you can't adhere to a set of common rules and common sets of implication, and there are wide variations in how it's used and applied, it's not extensively used. Furthermore, in terms of validation, the process and the research work that's been done is rife with confirmation bias or preferential selection. We find that a lot of the evidence was survey-based, based on people who gave it a good try and are measuring performance against a counterfactual. And really, without a common process specification or a balanced research summary that weighs both confirming and disconfirming evidence, our conclusions can't be valid. And what's notable about this panel today is we have all looked at advanced work packaging and tried to apply it. We've heard Wayne stories from the field. I would also volunteer at this point that the first time I met Gary Fisher was in a conference room in San Ramon, California 6 years ago, trying to advise on how to beneficially implement work-based planning and AWP on the Chevron portfolio. So this is a journey, but if we are all looking for ongoing confirmation of our entering viewpoint, we're sure to find it. The real value comes if you search for disconfirming examples, and we have provided several today. If you ask me for others, I can provide 5 others upon request. So there's a need for further study that defines a clear process specification. Is it rigidly adhered to, and what does the data say? Now, the second question is, if we even accepted premise 1, why do outcomes continue to be poor and there's still a gap? Obviously, 100 of you are on us with this call today. We are all either exploring or looking into the benefits of project production management, which is the implementation of base industrial engineering, operations research, and broadly operations science principles to capital projects that have guided a productivity revolution in manufacturing, but have been neglected to capital projects because they're different. When really capital projects are a form of batch production and not continuous flow, but nonetheless, the rules still apply, and we see greater value there. Now, Kristen, if we could advance to the next slide, and I'll keep this very brief. But if we look at the core tenets of work-based planning and advanced work packaging and project production management as defined by this institute, the design specifications as it's intended to work, batch size in work-based planning, AWP, 1 to 2 weeks, PPM 1 day. Agility and resilience are huge buzzwords, but it's proven. Smaller batch sizes give you greater flexibility. Secondly, the optimized production variable. We beat this to death. Work-based planning and advanced work packaging focuses on craft utilization, which really wrench time, time on tools, that's what it is. But really the objective of a production system for projects is to produce throughput and money. So wrong variable. Variability control. Workface planning and AWP works to release constraints from the workface through a use of time lags, weeks at a time, resource, and inventory buffering that all cost your organization's working capital. Furthermore, larger batch sizes amplify variability. These principles are not up for debate or discussion. They are proven. PPM focuses on mitigating controllable variability through risk management protocols to minimize buffers and delay the investment of that cash between when it's invested and when production is realized. The system of production. This has to do with how work, not administration, actually flows through the system. And it is proven through some of the capability building gains and industrial engineering principles that push production systems whereby we complete our work in advance and create piles of inventory results in lower productivity, and pull production where we reach upstream and grab when we're ready. This is the principle of Kanban and Kanban systems, or CONWIP as the Institute defines it. The trade focus in Workface planning, single trade. PPM is multidisciplinary. The planning burden, I alluded to this before, but it falls on these mythical creatures called the Workface planner, of which I've seen a scarcity of qualified resources and availability to even fill the role in the industry. And in PPM, where we actually involve the trades performing the work and planning it. You know, guess what? If you're planning your own work, you're more productive. Goes without saying. So it's easy for us to throw shade on what doesn't work. Hopefully we balance that to show you that we believe in a paradigm that does work, that obviates the knowable gaps related to Workface planning and advanced work packaging, design and execution.
Excellent. So that's anything our panelists want to add to this? This is a great slide of comparison.
A nice summary, Matt.
All right. Looks like I'm being prompted to move on to some panelist recommendations here. So you're in the you're in the thick of things. Your understanding of operations science may not, be very far up the learning curve. What are some things that we recommend that you could take on right now on your projects and make a significant difference in overall performance? And these are listed in not any particular order. I'm just going to go through them really quickly. And I don't normally read slides, but I want to emphasize getting your work package size, whatever you call it, down to 1 day of work or even smaller, will improve throughput, will improve the flow of the work, and it will improve performance. The term that we're landing on is production packages. And I think that conveys something different than an installation work pack. It really resonates with me, a production package. Task the people responsible for doing the work to plan the work. Let's bring it back. Workface planners ought to go away. Project, the cost engineering team, the planners, it doesn't work. If you give people the responsibility that are going to do the work for planning the work, you will generate higher quality, doable work plans. Adopt the philosophy of finishing what has been started before starting new work. And I can't tell you how big this is, because we project people have a bias to start things. And since all the work needs to get done, we want to start lots of things. And when we get stopped doing one thing, we'll start another thing because we want to keep people busy. Otherwise, we feel like we're being negligent. Well, I've learned that is actually deleterious to project performance. Getting more things started, more work in process, results in longer cycle time and increased overall cost. That's a fact of science. It's not an opinion. This isn't Gary Fisher opinion. That's science-based. And that means even if you got people standing around waiting on something to do, you're better off doing that than starting something else. We need an intense focus on solving the problems that prevented that daily planned work from being done. Okay, not off solving different problems, not solving what you think are the problems, but remove the barriers that keep the actual work from being done. And then provide only the materials needed for that 1 day of work to the craft. Your flow of material to the job site is a hugely critical factor. It should be pulled by the work, not pushed by management saying, we're going to push material packages into the field because we think that will get people working. They need stuff to do. In case they get stopped, they'll have something else to do. On that one project with Gorgon, we had a massive laydown area. That was just the tip of the iceberg. When you went out into the field, you saw little laydown areas all over the place. C-vans stuffed full of material, stuff piled up here, stuff piled up there. All things because we were pushing materials to the job site. Work couldn't get done on plan. We weren't solving the problems that prevented the work from getting done. Folks were moving on to other things and starting other things, and we had lots of things started. We didn't have things finished. So those are 5 things you can do right now out of the gate to improve your performance. But the real answer is learn about, adopt project production management. And we've had a fair number of questions here on, well, where do I go for more information? And there are some good resources. So, and I'm going to cover that here in just a minute. So does the panelists want to add anything to these recommendations before we move on? Matt,
Gary,
you
just one amplifying comment here. I mean, there was an article, and it was in the Construction Users Roundtable published fourth quarter last year that talked about the future of project delivery. And this group of large project owners, advanced 3 paradigms. One, workface planning and advanced work packaging. You've gotten our thoughts on that today. The second, project production management, and the other, lean construction. Now, the fact is 2 of these paradigms can work together, and a third is an oddball. Okay, so construction improvement isn't about selecting from the Chinese menu you want to choose. It's about engineering the whole system. And really, these recommendations, they're congruent with the principles of lean philosophy. The principles of lean, one of them, obviously just in time on inventory management, produce exactly what's needed, when it's needed, and not more, other than its waste. And what we told you today is workface planning and advanced work packaging engineers waste into the system and is not lean at all. So that's my last thought, Gary. Thanks for the opportunity.
Excellent. So let's move on to wrap things up. I want to announce the next virtual conference. Does critical path method scheduling work? Oh, this is going to be another good one. There's a lot of deeply held beliefs on this as well. I've had a fair number of questions. If you go to the next slide on where can I get more information? This is a recording, so it will be available at the projectproduction.org website. Other virtual conferences that we've had in the past, in case you missed them, are recorded there as well. And there's more information on the subject. You can always drop me an email and be glad to try to respond. So I want to thank everyone who dialed in to participate in this. Hope you got benefit from it. I want to thank very much our panelists for devoting the time and preparation and support of this. I think it was an excellent conference. Thank you all very much.